Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself. Feeling ready to kick your sales into high gear? We're here to help. Check out our sales coaching and consulting services at predictablerevenue.com. Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Stewart, and today I'm joined by Dr. Eimear Dolan. She's a researcher over at University of Sao Paulo, and we came in contact because I was writing a newsletter and about my previous experience, was kind of starting a side project called Athlon, and it was the goal was basically to help make establishing fitness habits fun. And we, at the beginning of the project, we set out to try and basically help people create and maintain fitness habits because we wanted to help ourselves and our users lose weight. Two of us were, as we kind of came to my friend Carl kind of coined the term that we all, of the category that we all sat in. We were all fat dads trying to lose the weight that we'd put on from having kids or being an entrepreneur and, just having all these things stack on top of us and then not having the time, having the desire to kind of figure it out and get back out there, but not having the time to dig through the exercise science and this and that. And so I did a peasant's version of kind of going through some papers and reading some books. And as I was writing the newsletter, kind of sharing what I learned about Athlon, I realized I had some gaps. And so I started reading some more papers, and that's when I came across Eimear. And you have a number of papers on exercise science. Do you want to give us kind of the Coles notes of the kind of your focus in the academic world?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm trained in exercise science. I did my degree in sports science and health back in my home country of Ireland. And my main areas that I've always been particularly interested in are this idea of fueling for exercise. How much energy do we actually need to take in? What happens if we take in too much, too little? Particularly interested, my main focus at the moment is on bone health, but I study it more broadly. I also have a lot of interest in female athlete physiology. Do women need different recommendations to men? And if so, what are they? But really the center of what I do has been around the energy regulation side of it. And in the last couple of years, probably the paper that you're referring to, I started to collaborate with some evolutionary biologists and to start to suddenly see this whole other world of these theories that are rarely discussed in my own field. They are, of course, sometimes, but not really. And it just opened up a whole new way of thinking for me. And so, yeah, that's in a very rambly way what I do right now.
I love it. I think I followed kind of the paper trail, pun not intended, of like looking at the authors and then kind of looking at, okay, who else was established and who else was in the lab. And I followed Dr. Herman Poncer in kind of his paper trail. That's the wrong word for it, but you kind of get the idea. And that's how I came across your paper, because you and Herman had written, Herman was a co-author on on the paper that I found. Maybe if we take a few steps back, because not everybody's going to know Poncer's work, could you give us just a brief summary on like what is, help us understand kind of Poncer's work? And the book that I'm referring to is called Burn. I can't remember the name of the actual paper, but I imagine you've got a pretty good idea here. So why don't you give us kind of a quick summary of like what that was about?
Yeah. So essentially, Herman Poncer is evolutionary biology by background, and several years ago, I can't remember what date it was or what exact year, but a good few years ago, he brought out a model or a theory that just kind of shifted a lot of perspectives on how we think about energy regulation. So it's called a constrained model of total energy expenditure. I think that's what you talked about, or what the one that you kind of started looking at. And essentially the theory in this is that increasing your energy expenditure, we all think, okay, if I exercise more, I'm going to burn more calories and therefore I'll lose weight. However, the theory that Poncer proposes is actually that we don't just add up all of the different categories of energy expenditure we have, that actually if you increase expenditure in one process, mainly we always focus on physical activity, you can actually compensate by reducing it in others, meaning you come out net the same. And in the exercise science world, this particular paper where he first came up with the theory was when he was working with the Hadza tribe in northern Tanzania, and they're doing energy expenditure estimates. And the assumption was that, well, hunter-gatherer tribes, they're hunting and gathering, they're highly active, they're living the way we kind of evolved. Surely they'll have way higher total energy expenditures than, say, an office worker in Canada or the US or Sao Paulo. But they didn't. The energy expenditures were roughly equivalent to what you'd expect from somebody living a far more sedentary lifestyle. So that's where he kind of came with this theory of compensation constraints.
Just for the annoyingly curious that are listening, how do they figure that out? I know it has to do with doubly labeled water, but I have no idea how that works. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, so doubly labeled water is essentially the gold standard that we have for measuring energy expenditure. And now the inner details myself, I won't really know either, but essentially you give somebody a stable isotope, they ingest it, you collect all of their pee for a period of however long you're doing it, like to measure generally over a week or so, and then you watch that isotope passing through the body, and it gives an idea of the turnover of carbohydrates and oxygen. I'm really garbling this explanation, but essentially it's the best means that we have to kind of really accurately assess energy expenditure. Then what we basically do is we use estimates from that double labeled water technique to create, say, prediction equations, etc., that we can use in a more practical way, more day-to-day way. So that double labeled water is essentially whenever you want to really measure energy expenditure, you need to go back to that measurement. So what he did was he measured it in those, and then he compared it to estimates that had been done on other populations.
And effectively, what I'm hearing he found is that they weren't. The assumption coming into it was they're going to be burning 3,000 calories, 4,000 calories a day, and that's how they're staying so lean. But that's not what they found.
But that's not what they found. So what they were actually finding is that the calories were in and around similar to what people following kind of in industrialized societies, far more sedentary lifestyles. And that's where he started thinking, well, actually, hold on then, what does this mean for physical activity and using physical activity as a way to control, say, body mass? Because as you've mentioned, or as we've discussed previously, a lot of what we talk about in terms of body mass control is in terms of this kind of calories in, calories out model, this kind of simple subtraction. However, it's like, well, these guys are doing a lot of activity, but why isn't it showing up in these estimates? So that was the theory. Now, it's important to say there is so many different factors that influence what we burn off, calories in versus calories out. It is very complicated, and there's a lot going on there. So I think that this theory is fascinating. It really got a lot of discussions going, but within the exercise science world, we were all like, but how? How could this apply to athletes? Because when you think of the sheer quantity of calories that athletes burn in training, where could it go? If we're going to subtract it from another process, from where? And that's when a group of us we discussed this several times, and we couldn't find anything in the literature kind of published on this. It was really kind of picking it apart and taking it step by step. So kind of we went on the approach of write the article you'd like to read, and a group of us got together and we invited Professor Ponser, because obviously if you want to talk about somebody's theory, the person who's going to know the best and the most in depth, and he luckily agreed to come on board, and that's where we came to the paper that you're talking about.
And I want to get to calories in, calories out in a minute, but I had the same thought myself. I ride my bike a lot, and that makes me sound like a 6-year-old. I'm going out, like little things on the spokes that go. Doo, doo. I've got a bucket in my I cycle. I'll go on like longer rides where an average ride I'll burn 1,500 to 2,500 calories. And I remember reading Burn, the book, Ponser's book, and thinking, okay, yes, the constrained model makes sense. And then I went for a bike ride where I think one that I was really like, wait, what do I do here? Because I burned 3,500 calories on a bike ride. And I'm thinking, according to my smartwatch, heart rate monitor, whatever, which we'll talk about the accuracy of that a little bit later. But I remember sitting there thinking like, I'm trying to end the day with a negative calorie deficit. And I'm pretty sure I can't eat, 3,500 calories plus my basal metabolic rate. but how many calories do I eat? And I know it's simple addition, subtraction at the end of the day, but getting to the right numbers to add and subtract was where I got stuck, and then I found your paper. Before we jump into kind of that particular question, I would love if you could just double down on the constrained model, because this one took me a little bit to really grok when I first read the book. And I don't want to try explaining it because I'm afraid I'll butcher it. But basically, I'll give it a go, and you can tell me how horribly incorrect I am. But effectively, our body's optimized so that we don't starve. And therefore, if your BMR is 2,000 calories, it's going to optimize the other things going on in your body so that it doesn't ever burn more than 2,000 calories, is roughly my caveman understanding of it.
Like the caveman references scene, it was all built off the caveman from the caveman era. So yeah, in a nutshell, that is kind of it. I think it's useful to maybe take a step back. And when we think about calories are literally a unit of measurement. To be precise, they are 1 kilocalorie is the amount of energy required to heat 1 litre of water by 1 degree Celsius, I think, if I remember that right. It's just a unit of how we measure things. Every process in your body is going to require energy, keeping your heart ticking over. Here where we're talking, keeping your brain functioning, breathing, everything is burning energy or using energy all the time. And we get that energy from the food that we eat. So when we think about calories in versus calories out, which is fundamental to understanding these different models, the classic way that we always thought about it is we kind of put our energy expenditure into different buckets, kind of have an energy budget separated out into different categories. The main one is your resting metabolic rate. So that is the amount of energy that you need to just keep ticking over. If you're lying still doing absolutely nothing, but just to keep the heart beating, to keep breathing, to keep everything running as it needs to be, that's going to be a certain amount of energy. That's your resting metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate. For this conversation, we'll just call them the same thing. And then on top of that, you're going to start adding up. So for example, another piece that we always add is the thermic effect of food. Every time you eat something, it takes a certain amount of energy to actually process it. The process of digesting, absorbing, sending the nutrients out. So you pay a small calorie tax on everything that you take in. And then we've got, for younger people, or maybe say athletes in a bulking up phase, we've got requirements of growth. But the most variable and interesting one, well, I'm an exercise scientist, of course, I think it's the most interesting one, is the cost of physical activity. So as soon as you start moving, you're upping that metabolic rate. So you're going to have your basic, and then you're upping it. So we always talk about our exercise we often talk about it in terms of how much above resting it's going to bring us. And that's where we get things like physical activity levels, i.e. if I do absolutely 0 and not 1, or more, that's impossible. You can't do that. even if you're in bed rest, you're still going to be a little bit up, because there's still processes that need to be dealt with. But if you're very, very sedentary, you're just going to have a little bit extra, maybe 20, 30, 40% above that basal metabolic rate. You start to train a few times a week. You get more moderately active. The more active you can get up into the 1.4s, the 1.5s in terms of your own basal metabolism. Elite athletes can go higher. If you want to go to the very elite, like for example, during the Tour de France, those guys are burning like 6-7 times their RMRs. Like, it's insane during that period. And obviously during training, again, seeing doubling is totally common.
Yeah. So what is the cap? Because it seems like I've read somewhere that there, in some, I can't remember if it was one of your papers, that there was a cap between like 2.5 to 5 times BMR as like the theoretical cap. But then you look at these monsters climbing these mountains in France and you're like, how is this possible? Just calorically.
So the difference there of what we're seeing is actually the difference between what people can manage to get to for a short time period and what people can sustain in the long term. So the caps that we were talking about, for example, the numbers you were talking about in that paper, we have observed up 5, 6, 7, which is actually similar to what we see in like migratory birds, kind of almost continuous activity. We have observed very, very high total energy expenditures relative to people's basal metabolism, but they're generally measured during, say, for example, an athletic event like, say, the Tour de France or one of the Grand Tours. So nobody's going to stay at that for forever and ever. It seems like in and around 2.5 is the BMR that people can kind of sustain and maintain without, sometimes people want to lose weight, but without necessitating weight loss. That seems to be in and around what we can sustain, the upper limit of what we can sustain. Now, this will vary person to person. This is a population kind of average. And that number also seems to coincide with the amount of calories that we can take in and process. Again, on a sustainable. We can all binge on a one-off and go above in terms of sustaining.
Interesting. I remember watching an interview. I think it was the idea that kicked off kind of this most recent, like, wait, my brain doesn't fully understand how this works, because I was watching an interview with Tadej Pogačar. Yeah, I've heard it 1,000 times, but I'm totally butchering it, so I apologize. They were talking about how many calories, and I think they were talking about specifically like carbs per hour that they had to ingest in order to be at like maximum fuel, and how they were saying I think you could do like 60 or something per hour, whereas like the average human can only ingest like 20 carbs per hour and like actually process it and get it into the bloodstream. And he had actually trained and built up to that, and they had a team of people helping him get there. And that to me was like, wait, what?
Yeah, that's a fascinating area. So what you're talking about now is, or what I assume is not the total calories throughout the day, but actually getting carbs in during the ride to have that sustained delivery. Have you ever come across a sports scientist called Asker Jukendrup? He's a fantastic sports scientist. He does a lot of work with cycling, but he has a lot of work around training the gut. And if I attempted to take that much simple carbs in on a ride, I wouldn't be on the bike anymore. I'd be running away somewhere to deal with with the effects. Most people can't manage to take that in, particularly while cycling. However, by slowly upping and essentially training the gut to deal with it, these elite riders can actually take in an awful lot more than the rest of us will manage.
All I'll say, without going into details, is this explains a few events I have had. Well, I did a couple half irons a few years ago, and I'll just leave it at that. There was a couple.
Yeah, I can fill in the blanks.
This makes sense now. Those gels, yeah.
They're great. They're a fast source. It's just that they go through the stomach quite quickly, and we want them to actually be absorbed out of the gut and not to go straight through. But we don't have to. Leaving the gut involves little receptors, and most of the time we don't need all that many. However, in an Ironman, you want to be able to take it in, suck it up and out into the body straight away. But unless the body is ready for that, that's why massive tip for anyone who's doing, say, a big event like that, particularly for the first time, always trial your nutritional plans in training races, because just because the research says, X grams per kilogram is the ideal, doesn't necessarily mean your body's going to tolerate it. And so always practice your training nutrition or your competition nutrition in a training.
Is this like the Zorro effect, where like you take a little bit of poison kind of your entire life and you slowly increase the dosage, and then at the end you could just take a massive amount, that kind of thing? Sorry to spoil the end of Zorro if you haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it. I'm not.
It's from the 90s.
I don't know.
Here's the same plot as they use the same idea in The Princess Bride, if you've ever seen that.
I get it. But
it was kind of a spoof on Zorro. Anyway, so if I'm training, basically take gels while I'm training so my body adapts to it, so that they don't just whiz right through me.
So the gels are one option that a lot of people like, because they're very convenient. Sometimes get nice flavors, but essentially what you're looking for there is a simple carbohydrate, something that is easily absorbed, that's going to give you that. It's kind of the opposite of the advice you get from general nutrition, because we don't really want to be having a diet high in, say, simple sugars routinely, because they give you this sugar hit. However, if in your bike, and you really need it, and you're in that, and your levels are dropping low, you want it delivered fast. And so that's where something like the gels are created to be absorbed very quickly and to give you that energy hit that you need. But different people use different things. For example, people will use a whole range of different carbohydrate sources, again, depending on preferences.
And so when you're racing, it's just, or when you have a big event, whether it's a race or anything, it's try a number of different sources. Did I hear the max carbohydrates you can adjust per hour? I think I heard in the interview with Pagacha was 20 for like a regular human, and then he was up to like 60 or 40 or something. Do you have any guidance there?
I do, and I'm going to be annoyed at myself for not remembering the numbers at the head, because I actually was listening to a talk with this by a guy called Trent Stellingworth recently. It's generally given in terms relative to your own body mass.
Okay.
It's 5 to 6 grams per kilogram. No, that would be a good bit more. No, sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the specific numbers. I can send them through to you after. Exactly.
If anybody's curious, I'll link to them in the show notes. And so you can take a look down there wherever you're listening. I want to sidebar, and I know we've gone sidebar on sidebar on sidebar. I have I'll just say an older family member who's a doctor, and they mentioned reading a study about sugar and how it doesn't make kids hyper. But what I heard you say about energy or, simple carb absorption and giving you an energy spike seems to be the opposite. I strongly suspect the study they had read might have been, sponsored by the sugar industry or something. Or maybe I'm just misunderstanding their point. Can you help kind of clarify that piece? Because it seems like I've heard this a number of times from a number of people who I think understand science, but it doesn't make sense to me.
So do you mean in terms of essentially what are simple sugars? What are...
do simple sugars, like ingesting them, do they increase your... they increase your immediate energy levels, and that's associated with kids going crazy after eating sugar, drinking sugar.
So, I have never specifically studied the kids going crazy after eating and drinking, but I do have nieces and nephews, and because I don't see them very often, I'm the aunt that just says yes to everything, and it certainly does seem to send them a little bit hyper. So essentially, when you're looking at carbohydrates are one of the main fuel sources that our bodies use. And essentially all carbohydrates are just chains of sugars, of little sugar molecules. However, the complex carbohydrates are all tied together. So they need to be broken down so that they're released into the bloodstream a little bit more slowly. So here we're talking about complex carbohydrates, like come from a lot of plant foods. Your simpler sugars are essentially simpler units, and so they're delivered much more quickly. In general nutrition advice would recommend against eating a lot of pure simple sugars because of that very rapid delivery. It can cause, there's a hormone called insulin that is responsible for essentially sending the carbohydrate to where it needs to go, and it helps it absorb into the muscle. But if you're constantly hitting your bloodstream with this spike, things can start getting the capacity to regulate that can start to get a little out of whack. So the general health advice would be to try to minimize the simple sugars, or if you're going to have like simple sugars, for example, many fruits will have simple sugars, but they also have a lot of fiber, which slows down the delivery, whereas a lot of ultra-processed foods and sweets and cakes and things have just that instant hit of sugar, nothing else. So for your general health and for your fancy level around the kids, you kind of want to avoid spiking too frequently. However, for an athlete who is using up all of who has really raised their metabolic rate, has raised their energy demands because of a long, prolonged cycle, well, now suddenly you need it. So it's not like simple sugars are good or bad. It's all about the context of when you're taking them and what you need them for. So if you're low, getting a quick hit is a good thing. If you're already okay or even high, adding in even more, is that could send you a bit over the top. So no food is good or bad, but foods can have different effects in different situations. So I'm not sure if I answered it all there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I'm asking kind of questions across a wide spectrum of science, and I appreciate you kind of humoring me here and helping the caveman learn fire. I appreciate it.
No worries at all. I'll try to answer, but if we get to things that are too far, I'll let you know when I'm fairly. I don't know what I'm saying. No problem whatsoever is basically what I'm saying.
Fantastic. So when we talk about the things that, like, because we were talking about kind of calories in, calories out, and we can't think of it as a basic accounting model of like, okay, my RMR is, 2,000, and so I can eat 2,000 calories, and then I'm going to exercise. If I do 2,000 calories of exercise, I can't eat 4,000 calories. This is the thing that with the constrained model, when I first read about it, I went, dang, MyFitnessPal has been lying to me. Because I got the scale and I've been weighing things, which is an education in and of itself. Like, I don't eat granola anymore because you're like, that's 700 calories? That's so small. I couldn't believe how many calories were in some things and how few calories were in other things. Mm-hmm. But I also feel lied to by MyFitnessPal because it says, okay, well, you sync your Strava in there and it says, okay, you've done 1,700 calories of exercise, so you can eat an extra 1,700 calories. And I probably followed that like religiously for like pretty much everything went on a scale before I went in my mouth with this, except for like water and definitely beer. I didn't weigh beer. But I followed that for a year and I didn't lose nearly as much as I thought I would. At the end of the year, it was probably a couple of pounds, as opposed to like, what MyFitnessPal said is like, well, I should have burned like, 10 pounds because, a pound of fat is 3,500 calories. And I was in, I had a fairly strong deficit according to MyFitnessPal.
So I think there's a few things here. One, I'll say I do think it's useful to get at least a notion of what your calories in and what your calories out, and tracking like that can give you an idea of what you're doing. I think for me, the important thing here is to treat those estimates as a rough guideline rather than as a rigid rule, and be aware that there are many things that might impact both what you eat and what you burn off. So kind of trusting too much the estimates from an app or whatever, you have to be aware that they can be out by quite a lot. So I think what brought us to this conversation, you're looking at this kind of compensation model. Now, some people interpret that as kind of a zero-sum game. If I burn 1,000 calories on this bike ride, well, then I'm going to just reduce it somewhere else and it's like it's wiped out. I don't believe in that. That's kind of
like the body hits Control-Alt-Delete on like 1,000 calories worth of like background systems. You're like, I don't need that.
Exactly. And when you read like Herman Ponzer's doesn't work, isn't quite that kind of positive, negative, and clear cut either. But what I do think we could be aware of is that sometimes, say you go on that bike ride, what are you often going to do when you come home? Lie down on the couch, take a nap. A lot of the times people will reduce outside other behaviours, which means that the net increase might not be quite as much as you said. Another thing is that, thinking back to that thing I was talking about, RMR, and exercise raising us above what we standard, above what our body needs. When you look at that, okay, I burnt that much in my bike ride. Well, actually, your body would have burned a certain amount of those calories even if you'd just been lying on the couch, because it still needs to keep going. So you have increased it. It's just that within those couple of hours that you're riding, you're increased it, but maybe not quite as much as you thought of, because you would have been burning some of them anyway. So you can't just add it on to your RMR. Right. And then the other thing is we need to be very cautious that the numbers that our watches are giving us, particularly in terms of calories, need to be taken with a large grain of salt. And they're
not
evidence.
I'd say no. That might be counterintuitive.
And dehydrated and salty foods. Maybe it can be useful in the right context, but no, metaphorically. And they're not great, to be honest. So if you're kind of using that, it's easy to kind of calculate out on paper. Okay, I'm going to burn X calories, I'm going to eat X calories, and if a pound of fat is going to be X calories in 6 months, I will be this weight. That's easy to calculate out on paper, but it's not how the body works in practice. So there's going to be a certain amount of compensations and adaptations that happen when you go to a higher activity level. It sounds like you were very focused on your intake, but it is notoriously difficult to maintain, to keep an eye on your food in the long term, to track. Most people, almost all of the estimates that we have in the research in terms of how accurate are people at tracking their own food intake, people tend to really wildly underestimate.
Yeah, I put everything on a scale. Like, I mean, pretty much everything, and I'm only 60 to 70% confident I got everything correct. You know,
and putting everything on a scale in the first place is still a lot more than most people. Like, most of the time, we're just kind of eyeballing what we've taken and guessing what it is.
Totally, yeah. When I first put it on the scale, I was like, I'm trying to guess in my head. Okay, little prediction machine. How much peanut butter am I putting on a piece of bread? And then you weigh the bread, and then you peanut butter it up, and then you put it back on, and you do the math. You're like, holy shit, I was way off.
Yeah, it is. It's notoriously difficult, and it's also things up like, you know, the MyFitnessPal or whatever is that this banana, but one banana is not the same as another banana. They have slightly different compositions themselves. Like, you can start to go a little crazy if you start to track too much. Look, I think tracking can be useful. I think it's useful to use. It can be useful to use prediction equations, particularly if you're starting out on a new training program, etc., to get an idea of what you're burning. And can be very useful to track and see, to get an idea of what you're consuming. But I think just be aware that it's only a very rough guideline. It's very hard to track. And it can get difficult. People can get quite obsessed sometimes with trying to monitor every calorie, trying to control it. And a lot of the time their biology is against them. The food environment is against them. It can make it quite stressful. So I think there's potentially other ways to maybe reframe.
I remember being extremely mad at MyFitnessPal. Not specifically MyFitnessPal, but just like, I spent a year doing this, and for like very minimal gains. Now I learned a whole bunch, and it was educational, and we still try and do it once a year. We do like dry January, and I try and I do a version of that where I kind of weigh everything, and it helps me kind of reset the bad habits I develop in December. Because December is always a good month for fun and not a good month for health and fitness.
But isn't that the problem? Isn't that the issue right there? It's kind of like health and fitness or fun. Sure. I think the best scenario is when we can manage to put those together and find strategies that are actually fun.
100%. I want to get an educated guess from you, and there's no correct way of giving me a number, but I'm trying to work out for, say, I do an hour of a hard bike ride, which is generally correlates to about 1,000 calories for me for the type of riding that I'm doing. The smartwatch that I have, it is measuring heart rate and all that. If I'm doing, so for every hour of bike riding I'm doing, what's your rough guess of like how many calories should I consume to just even out? And again, this is a guess. We're not going to hold you to, like, we're not I'm not going to submit this to science afterwards.
So the way I would look at it, the advice I would give in terms of you're thinking this, jot these down, get an idea. You've told me you've already kind of estimated your RMR, which again is going to be a rough guide. Your own specific RMR might be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, and it's never possible to know, are you the high or the low one. So get that, make an estimate. I would say rather than just kind of adding on that 1,000 calories, you can have a look at different physical activity levels, and they will tell you what kind of, okay, so on a day that you're doing X session, you're going to increase your BMR by X amount. So let's just say 1.5, 1.6. we're gonna end up with a calorie intake of in and around, let's say, do you do say 3.5 on a hard bike day. I assume, are you doing that most days or every day, or?
I'm doing about 24 right now. I'm doing about 24K a day of gravel cycling, and that's about an hour 20, give or take, hour and 10 of like hard riding, and it's like that's pushing at a good pace at a fairly high, not like max heart rate zone, but it's like the orange one on my smartwatch. I can't remember. Is it anaerobic threshold? Maybe just below anaerobic threshold, whatever the one below that is.
So you can absolutely use the apps to get an idea of what you're at. But I would say that use them as a guide, but have something else. Think about your big of why are you doing this, in terms of what do you want to get out of it, and why are you tracking calories in the first place. And I think this is something we sometimes get very focused on, the calories, and like, oh, I have to meet this. But we're always using these to get to some bigger goal. Those goals are generally either to improve performance, to improve health, or to improve aesthetics. I think are the three broad categories that people will generally fall into. Using things like tracking your calories, or even like measuring like your weight on the scales, they're can be useful metrics to help you plan a strategy to get to your goal. But they should not be the goal on their own. I think it's a commonly used term that once a metric becomes an objective, it loses all value as a metric. Because if, let's just say in this example, you mentioned that you were kind of embarked on this hoping to lose weight, and were kind of surprised about maybe why you didn't. Fair enough, the scales maybe weren't going on the thing, but why did you want to lose weight in the first place? Do you feel fitter when you're training more? Do you feel like you have more energy levels throughout? Do you feel more comfortable in your body? In which case I'd say that's maybe a better outcome than simply the number of the scales that can be. If it really is the scales, well, I think that's where you have to start thinking, okay, I've estimated that I'm going to need, let's just say, 3 to 3.5 on the days that I'm doing a tough ride. A tougher, probably more on the 3, if we can consider some. If you're doing that for a while and you realize, okay, well, I really want to lose weight, I'm doing this for thing, nothing's budging, well, maybe we need to dial it a bit. Maybe we've overestimated. So use those calorie guides as a wide guideline, and then dial up or dial down depending on how you're getting on with your broader objective, which can be the scales. I would generally recommend something more like track your overall, if it's for health, is there a specific health outcome that you want? If it's overall energy and vitality, are you feeling better? If it's more aesthetics, are you feeling good in your clothes? The way you walk when you train more, the way your clothes hang on you. So I would argue they could probably be more meaningful. But if the numbers aren't really working out and getting you to your goal, well, that means you need to either dial up or dial down.
Yeah, it's all of the above, and it's a whole lot easier to drag 190 pounds up and down a mountain than it is 210 pounds or 220 pounds. And so part of it is like, I want to feel better in my clothes, and not the Louis C.K. quote of like, when I die, I don't want people to go, oh yeah. I want them to be surprised, be like, oh yeah, he had it coming. That's not the exact quote, but that's the general gist. And I want to be able to climb that mountain faster and not have to haul an extra 20 pounds up with me.
And that is a big thing. So what you talk about now in terms of particularly on hillier climbs is your power to mass ratio. So have you come across that? Have you ever calculated yours?
I've done my FTP because I have a trainer, but I haven't been I haven't been on Zwift since last winter, so I don't know what it is current.
But I think this is an interesting thing around a lot of training and nutritional strategies, particularly for cyclists, will be around optimizing this ratio, because essentially your power is how many watts you can actually push out, and then you divide it by your weight. And if you are the higher your power to mass ratio, the easier it is to push up the hill because you've got more power and you're pushing a smaller weight. So that can be a really useful metric. And you mentioned Audicare, etc. Like those guys can maintain just the most insane bar to mass outputs. However, I think that one thing that I would advise against is focusing too much on the body mass side of the equation, because sometimes what that can do is having a knock-on effect on the power side of the equation. So really what you want to do is up the power and down the weight at the same time, because then your muscles are fully aboard. But that's very, very hard to do at the same time. And the difficulty is that if somebody is focusing on reducing body mass, they're generally restricting calories, which means that they might not be getting as much out of the training session as they could if they were fueled up and ready to go. It's very hard to, we all want for our body mass, we want that, say that we want it all to come from fat, and more specifically, we want it to come specifically, I want the fat around my belly, or I want the fat, that's what we want, but the body doesn't always do it like that. And it is common to, if you're calorie restricting, to also lose some muscle. So this is where I would say the thinking about your goals is so important, because sometimes focusing on one part of it can mean that you lose sight of the bigger picture. So if you want to push up the hill more, you're like, okay, yeah, reducing body mass can be useful, but not if it impacts your ability to generate force. Not if you're losing muscle, not if you don't have the fuel to push up. So that's where really focusing on the power side and the training can be quite useful.
It definitely is like two very challenging goals to pursue at the same time. When I was doing training for the half irons, it was, I thought, okay, I'll do a couple of half irons. I think I ended up doing 3 and 1 Olympic distance, and I gained weight, and I was like, dang it. I spent 2 years or a year and a half doing these 4 races, and my goal was to lose weight, and I put on weight. It was only like a pound or 2. My body composition was very different. And so overall, a positive health effect, but I was like, I was trying to lose weight.
But I would say there, the question I would ask is, in that particular scenario, and I have never reached the level of doing a half Ironman, so congratulations. And but why did you want to lose weight at that point? Because if I would say you're obviously were in great shape and probably still are, if you're still riding that much, like you're obviously extremely fit. If your body composition, you probably put on some muscle in there.
Yeah, it was partially I want to be able to keep up with my kids. It was partially I don't want to look like a bag of milk running across the finish line.
And did you find, just out of curiosity, did you find while you were in that kind of super fit area, like, did you notice something in terms of, were you keeping up with your kids any better?
Oh, yeah. For sure. Yeah. I was, yeah, I mean, it was, I was definitely keeping up with the kids and being able to, go up and down stairs, without, I was in much better physical condition, 100%. My clothes fit better, everything. It was one of the things that kind of tipped me on to like, okay, maybe weight isn't the only goal.
And I think there's an interesting, like it's part of the societal thing there as well, that we're so focused on it. But I went through a similar thing, talk about not practicing what you preach. It was about a year or 2 ago. I always remember this. The battery in my scales in my house had been gone for about 2 years, so I had no idea what I weighed. But I went through a phase where I was actually pretty happy in terms of I was cycling quite a lot. I was doing quite a bit of yoga. I was feeling good, and I was feeling good. Not just I was feeling good, feeling like my clothes were fitting quite well. I had a lot of energy. I was feeling good in my body. And then my boyfriend bought a battery for the scales out of nowhere and put it in. And I stood in the scales, and I was the heaviest I'd ever been. And I was just straight away.
You bastard.
Fat and ugly, And I was just like, you do this stuff for work. But as soon as I saw that number and it was up, feeling more energetic, feeling good in my clothes. And I was doing well on the bike. I was keeping up with groups that I hadn't been able to keep up with before. But all of that went out the window when I saw this little number pop up, and then I just hit the scales and haven't looked at it since. I have no idea what it'll be right now. But I think that we do tend to get quite hung up on the scales. But again, going back to that point, I think that we generally, we say we want to lose weight. And then if you say you want to lose weight or you want to reach a particular weight, I would always say you have to ask why. What is it for? And that has to be, that can be a way to get to a bigger goal, but sometimes it can be counterproductive, because if you're restricting so much that you just feel like absolute shit, that doesn't help anyone. That's counterproductive. You say, oh, I want to lose weight to feel healthier and feel better about myself, but then you feel like crap because you're hungry. You're not getting there. Maybe putting on muscle if it's for aesthetics. Well, actually putting on a bit of muscle and improving your posture. I think we move better when we're in better shape. Could actually be far more productive. You may be happier about how you look than, again, the number. I think the scales has a role, but I feel like it's overemphasized.
Totally. I think it's like the math that you do of like how, or the math that I was doing of like how tall I am versus how much I weigh. And I'm like, what category am I in? Am I like, I wouldn't say a bodybuilder, but I have muscle on me and I have a big frame. And so like going in and sitting on that or standing on the scale, I don't sit on the scale. I know that's not a thing that people do. But there was a period where I was like quite muscly and like obese as I stepped on the scale. And I'm like, this can't be true. I'm like, I'm very lean. I'm,
Every professional athlete for certain sports are going to score in as obese on those called the BMI, body mass index. And it's a broad level screening tool. Maybe it had some utility, but we're getting into the argument now as well of there's two different things. One, BMI doesn't take into account your body composition. It's just assuming that if you're heavy for your weight and then that's unhealthy or obese,
it's assuming
that's all fat. Not necessarily. Athletes. The other thing is, and the argument right here is, can you be the fat versus fit? Because there's a lot of people who maybe are carrying a bit too much, and actually their health outcomes are very similar to people with similar fitness levels. It's unhealthy to be inactive, unfit, and with a high body fat. However, if you fall in the BMI, the overweight, or even the obese BMI category, but you're very fit and healthy, you're very fit and active, actually there's very little consequence for your health. Now, it's hard to fall into the obese category for it not to be muscle and to be very physically active. So like these things kind of, they correlate with each other, but really weight, BMI, it's just such a tiny piece of the picture.
Fair enough. Not a great measuring stick and not something that we should step on the scale and stress ourselves out about.
No, it can be useful. It can serve a function, it can serve a role, but only in pursuit of a larger goal, which I would say is generally performance, health, general well-being, and aesthetics. I think is also a very valid goal.
Totally. I think as I read, I think Exercised First, which is Daniel Lieberman's book, which is a fantastic read if anybody hasn't read it or heard of the book. And then did Daniel and Ponser, did they work together? Because I remember him mentioning in the book that it was in his lab, but now they're two separate universities and I couldn't find the history there.
I believe, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that Daniel Lieberman was Herman Ponser's PhD supervisor.
That's what it was. Okay.
So I think that's where the relationship started, and that's where I know there's obviously a lot of overlap there in the Burn and Exercise, the books. I believe that's where it started.
Cool. I want to come back to, and we'll kind of land the episode with some high-level guidance around kind of fueling and exercising. We've spent a lot of time talking about exercising. I want to spend some time talking about fueling. Because I always think of like the guy with the Twinkie diet, who proved you could lose weight by only eating Twinkies, which to me sounds like a tortured existence. Like I could not handle
choose
that.
Twinkies. If I'm going to choose one food to make a point on it wouldn't be that.
It absolutely would not be that. It absolutely. But maybe that was his thing. So let's talk about fuel, because you and I had an interesting conversation in kind of the pre-interview and kind of and before about the quantity versus quality argument. So help me understand, if I'm thinking about fueling, what are some general guidelines I should be considering?
So I think for me, nutrition and exercise are two sides of the same coin. You really can't or shouldn't think about one without the other. You're not going to get the best out of your exercise program unless you're fueling appropriately. But at the same time, simply eating all the good stuff and never moving your body is also not an ideal. We need that too. I think we've talked a lot about quantity of calories, but I think it is way more useful and actually effective to focus on the quality of the diet. And actually the best way to get to an appropriate quantity is to focus more in on the quality, because our bodies are actually in their natural environments. Our bodies are actually quite good at knowing what we need and how much we need. It's just that we're not really in our natural environments anymore. If you think about how long has human evolution been going on versus how long has, say, the internet been available? I think I asked ChatGPT, I don't know how accurate this is, but it's something like for 0.001% of human evolution, we've had the internet, and now it dominates our lives. So I think if we can, and I'm not by any means recommending that people start to take like caveman diets or because, but there are elements of the modern food environment that are quite difficult for our bodies to cope with, particularly the emphasis on very processed and ultra processed foods. Like, think about it, how much of your food do you unpack by tearing plastic rather than peeling? We all do. And look, there are a lot of benefits to figuring out ways to make foods last longer and be more accessible, of course. But from a fueling point of view, I was rambling a lot. I'll get back to the actual question that you asked. I think particularly for people who are highly active, you have to be focused on fueling and be very aware that your body needs that energy to train. And if you don't give it to it as food, it has to come from somewhere. Now, ideally, we're like, oh yeah, great, take my stomach fat, whatever it is. Sometimes the body will do other things. Sometimes it will suppress other functions. It's kind of like your phone going into battery saving mode when the juice is getting low. It's trying to eke out that last bit that it has, and it ends up dialing down things, physiological functions. This can have really negative long-term effects, particularly for highly active people. Have you heard of the relative energy deficiency in sport model, or the concept of low energy availability?
REDS, is that what that was the acronym? REDS? Yeah. Exactly. I read a few papers. I wouldn't claim to understand it, but I've read about it, yeah.
It's essentially just looking at what happens to the body when we habitually, when we have inadequate energy available to run basic body processes after the demands of training. So if you're doing a shitload of training and you're not fueling, the body has to get the energy from somewhere, and sometimes it has to. This is where these compensatory behaviors can come in, where it kind of down-regulates things. But, for example, athletes who don't fuel have a much higher risk of bone stress injury, and because the bones end up getting more brittle. Female athletes who reduction of the menstrual cycle, etc., is very common for people who are not fueling, are not able to fuel adequately. This is the body dialing down those old processes. So we don't want that to happen. We want to make sure we're giving the body what it needs. And I would say, in terms of simple tips to fuel, is try to learn to trust your body rather than the watch. More so, focus around foods high in fiber, a lot of plant-based foods, high in protein. Make sure you're getting that. If you've got a decent amount of fiber in your diet and you're getting your protein, your body is quite good at figuring out when to stop. It's much harder to overeat on those things. And
there's some simple calculations to work out how much protein your body needs per kilogram.
Yeah, so for the general population, it's recommended 0.8 grams per kilogram. However, for athletes, we would generally advise quite a bit higher, up into the 1.2. If you're really in kind of a strength-based sport, you might be really getting right up to the 1.5, 1.6.
Now, when you say athletes, do you mean like professional athletes, or like some guy who's riding his bike, a couple times a week?
I would say, yeah, based off the... We don't need to go that high if you're kind of, say, riding a few times a week, but protein has a very satiating effect. It is essential to support your muscles are working hard. You end up breaking down a bit. It's essential to turn them over, particularly if you're doing resistance training alongside your your bike riding, which is a good thing. It's good to mix some resistance and strength training in with your aerobic work. So yeah, you probably don't need to go right up to that higher level of 1.5, 1.6. However, at least aiming for that midpoint. If you're active, you want to be a bit beyond the basic general population requirement. And also anyone who's at risk for particularly muscle loss, for example, if somebody has a health condition or just simply with aging, having the higher protein intake can be really, really useful.
Fantastic. I feel like I was missing something. Before we go, I wanted to talk about kind of why we can't trust our smartwatch, because you've mentioned that earlier and I kind of mentally flagged it in the conversation. Why can't we trust our smartwatch? I understand why I can't trust the scales, because even when I was measuring everything, I'm still only like 65% confident that I actually got everything. Why can't we trust our smartwatches? They're looking at our heart rate. They're doing the basic math.
And I think that the thing to always consider here is that they're doing the basic math, but they're doing the basic math based off prediction equations that were developed on a small group of people and that are always going to have an error margin. So let's say, for example, you mentioned you measured your RMR. Usually you'll use a prediction equation that will take into account, are you male or female? What height are you? What weight are you? Some of them, if you have access to it, how much muscle mass you have, etc. So it's just saying for a typical man of your height and weight and age, you should be burning in around this. However, there's no such thing as a typical person. That's just on average what we'd expect for somebody of your size. But there's going to be individual variability. Some people are going to be higher, some people are going to be lower. And while these equations can be quite useful for, say, getting an idea of in and around what we expect for a group, as an individual, you've no idea, am I one of the ones that just happens to be a bit higher, happens to be a bit lower? And that plus or minus really can stretch quite far. So you don't really know if it's exactly what you are. It'll give you an idea and it'll probably be roughly accurate. But then all of the other aspects are generally built on that. You're taking a kind of a rough estimate and then you're saying, well, probably when you're on the bike, if you're reaching this heart rate, your metabolic rate is going up by this amount. But there's error in there too. There's error at every step of the way. So you're kind of piling rough estimate on rough estimate, which means at the end, you've got an idea of what you're doing. But the data, going back to say we mentioned the doubly labeled water, if you actually compare the data that the smartwatches are giving versus quite in-depth lab-based assessment, the estimates really aren't great.
Can I do my own doubly labeled water?
Fairly expensive. How's your business going?
Okay.
It's a very... I have no idea. I'm sure there are companies somewhere that would do it in a commercial way. I've only ever seen it done in a lab setting. I'm sure there are commercials that there's a way of getting in touch with a university that runs it. It's quite a complex technique, so not all universities will do it. There tends to be a few kind of centres where everyone sends their samples, kind of places that are specialised. I'm sure it's available.
I'm close to UBC in Vancouver, so I'm like, maybe I'll try and wiggle my way into a study there.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was saying. If you sign up for the studies, you get a lot of this done anyway. So maybe seeing what's going on, and they're generally, well, I know from my point of view, anyway, delighted when people are coming to volunteer for studies. So it could be interesting to see if there's a way in. It's not something that's going to be widely accessible for a lot of people.
Fair enough. When you were explaining why I can't trust the calories on my smartwatch, it reminded me of one of Ponser's papers that I read. I think he was a co-author and near the back as well of the of the order. There was no evidence for metabolic adaptation during exercise-related energy compensation. Are you familiar with that one? With that paper?
I guess I'm not sure exactly which one you're talking about now, but it might be. So where this is actually the point of my own paper that I led that I kind of forgot to talk about, but where we come at, where my perspective on this based on a whole range of data is that we see the largest evidence of metabolic compensation and adaptations when people are in energy deficit. And the way I think about this in terms of trade-offs, energy is a finite resource. If you use it in one process, it's not available for another. If you are burning a lot of energy in training and you're matching that by taking in an appropriate amount, well, the body has enough coming in that it can fuel the training, it can distribute out to all the different processes that it needs. It doesn't need to tap into its energy stores. We have to have a certain amount of fat, both because it is essential functions for the body and also to have a small backup. We don't need too much, but we have to have an amount there. But the ideal situation for the body is that it takes in X, it distributes it out throughout the body, and everything gets its piece of the pie. But what happens if you are taking in less than you are habitually burning off? The body has to do an internal reallocation. And the best, I think, example that or parallel that I've heard is like, think there's like money in, money out. You earn a certain amount in a week or a month. You have a certain amount of bills to pay. If you are earning less than is required to cover all of your costs, you need to make some cuts somewhere. Mm. And that's what happens in the body. If there's not enough going in to be able to simultaneously fuel all biological process and fuel your training, well, the body has to figure out a way to stretch out what it does have, which means it'll often send less to some places, or to certain processes. So what our kind of hypothesis is that the extent of compensation that you're going to see is going to be determined by your capacity to fuel what you're doing. And this is always going to be a huge thing for we start out talking, say, the grand tours, etc. The amount of calories that those guys can manage to burn in a day, and they want to burn as much as they possibly can because they want to go further and faster and do as much as they can. But that's going to be limited by what they can actually get in. And by the time we get to the kind of the grand tour riders, the kind of the elite level, with the best will in the world, it's very, very hard to eat the sheer volume, the sheer quantity of calories required to sustain that, particularly if you're exercising. Going back to what we were saying, the gut won't always, you can put it in your mouth, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get to your muscles as quickly as you want. So yeah, really in terms of the compensation, it's going to be, and I think the paper you're referring to, is one, I can't remember the first author, but essentially they were showing that the strongest signs of compensation were in those people who had lower calorie intakes. Once you have an adequate calorie intake, you don't really see as much compensation.
Interesting. Thank you. I want to thank you. I know we're kind of exploring, and I'm bringing up papers that this one only came out in June of this year. Flanagan, E.W. Flanagan. I'll email it to you afterwards. It basically showed that only 50% or 48% of individuals exhibited exercise-related energy compensation.
It's not as widespread as perhaps we might think, particularly from the metabolic adaptations. I think the body will only do that when it's forced to. When you're really squeezing it, when you're like, okay, I have so limited energy here, where am I going to send it?
Right. So I want to land with maybe let's start with a couple of your favorite books on the subject, so something that us cavemen can consume and enjoy, and then we can get into kind of like 3 or 4 points of like high level guidance around fueling and exercising.
So books, I think I really enjoyed the two that you mentioned earlier. I think Exercise by Daniel Lieberman is extremely interesting, as is Burn. From the nutrition side of things, I've just finished reading David Raubenheimer's Eat Like the Animals, and I personally found that really fascinating. And it was very much about how he includes humans as one of the very many species that he's investigated. But he's seen similar patterns and trends and all, and his whole focus is around why do we select the foods that we do? Particularly in a modern society, we have so many options, as do often animals in the wild. Why do we select what we do? What makes us start? What makes us stop? And yeah, I found that one really fascinating. He's a fantastic researcher. He's really cool work.
I'm enjoying it so far. I'm only a couple chapters in, and it's quite interesting so far. And so if we had to land with like a couple of points of like, if you just skipped the entire podcast and you jumped right to this section, what would be your kind of couple of points of guidance on kind of fueling and exercising?
Fueling and exercising. If you want to get the most out of your training program, you need to fuel first. You need to make sure that you're getting in what you need. I would say on that, you can use things like watches, etc., as a guide. However, what you really want to do is to find a way to tune into your own body to figure out, am I recovering well? Am I doing well on my rides or whatever your sport of choice? Am I performing well? How is my energy levels throughout the day? How am I getting on? Try to take the information, the feedback from your body rather than from your watch, because it's harder to trust that. If weight loss is a goal, I would just strongly encourage you to think, why? What is the ultimate? And weight loss can be a very valid goal, but people will generally be doing it in pursuit of a higher level goal in terms of, is it to feel better? Is it to have more energy? Is it to improve your health? Is it to improve your aesthetics? Whatever it is. But think about that and be guided by your longer term goal, not by the numbers on the scales. They're only a way to give you an idea of where you're going. They're only a metric, but keep your eye on the price, which is going to be individual to each person. So I think I'm trying to think of the main points we talked about. Probably on the fueling side of things, I would say also try to base your diet as much as possible in a wide range of plant-based foods that have high fiber content, high quality, lean proteins. And really, if you're doing that and you're minimizing the ultra-processed, the junk food that is manufactured to be as palatable as possible, making it hard to resist. But if you are doing that, your body's pretty good at figuring out what it needs.
Very cool. Eimear, thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to ask one last favor. If we could end the episode with the anecdote you shared with me in our pre-interview about visiting the Primate Research Center.
Oh, yes. Oh, that was fascinating. So I had the honor of going to an event in China there in August. This was an event organized by Professor Eimear, who I've just mentioned. And we went to visit a primate research center, which essentially in this place in China, for whatever reason, some group of monkeys have kind of come down out of the forest and they hang around in this area, and it's really turned into a tourist attraction, which means that they are now living a very different life to what their natural lifestyle is. They're staying in one place. They're not foraging anymore. So activity levels are way down. Tourists are coming and they're bringing foods and they're feeding them. And this is now the animal's main source of food. So they're eating a lot of ultra-processed crap, basically, again, that packaged stuff, rather than going into the forest and foraging. And the purpose of the research centre that we were visiting was, what they're doing is investigating these and seeing how does this transition into a different kind of lifestyle impact their health, their social behaviours, the group dynamics, etc. So it's just a really interesting area. And I think it's just fascinating because in many ways, we are those monkeys who have evolved in a particular environment and have transitioned now into an environment where physical activity is largely unnecessary. The food environment is completely different now. You don't even need to go to a supermarket. You just hit a number on a phone and food just arrives. So we're transitioning to a very different environment. This is called a mismatch, where the way we evolved is quite mismatched to where we're currently living. And that's something that we really need to learn how to deal with, to create environments and to create strategies that work with our bodies rather than against them.
And just to fulfill my curiosity, did they look like regular monkeys? I'm picturing them all with beer guts, kind of looking like Homer Simpson.
There was a few of them now. Now, to be fair, so the actual research center do have, they also have like control groups of monkeys that live in the forest. Well, we didn't go there. We went to visit these. They did look very chubby, to be honest. Not the baby ones. The baby ones are actually having a ball because they're all playing, and in some ways there was all this time freed up for more play for the young ones. But the older ones were just sitting around, and some of them were quite scary because like they're quite big and they've big teeth, and they were I very much felt like they're here for their benefit. If I get in their way, I wouldn't go too thick. So yeah, but some of them did look pretty chubby, and there's a lot of just sitting around.
Well, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been really fun for me, and thanks to everybody for listening, especially if you made it all the way to the end. We'll get back to entrepreneurship and sales for our podcast next week. But thanks for listening, and thanks again to Eimear for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.